I'm always interested in stories that really kind of touch on taboo subjects. While it's difficult to sell people on series that do such things, it's also one of those things where you get into a really kind of a mindset of, was this worth telling, or is it something that really just plays into the perversion of the taboo itself? And Higehiro is definitely one of those cases where I'm struggling with if it had enough context to itself that it's warranting that sell or not. But this is my review of Higehiro. After being rejected, I shaved and took on a high school runaway, a 13-episode series that aired in the spring 2021 anime season. So let's jump into it. Higehiro definitely has the most misleading title. It's after being rejected, he shaved and took on a high school runaway. But that's not necessarily how the series itself opens up. It opens up with Yoshida, a office worker who at some point he is confessing, or at least trying to get with a co-worker of his, and is quickly kind of rejected by her. And after he goes to a bar and drinks a bunch, he ends up going home, where he ends up running to a high school runaway who is out in the street in the middle of the dark. And after she kind of asks if he can stay at his place a couple times, he finally allows it. He says, yeah, you go ahead and stay at my place for the night, and then go from there. And what this kind of turns into is this girl really doesn't have any place to go. She doesn't want to return home, but he kind of offers her a place to stay because of her circumstances itself. So like I said, the title is kind of misleading in that it kind of implies that he was rejected, then went and shaved himself just so that he can pick up a high schooler and take her home, which in actuality, he got rejected by somebody his age, a coworker, and then after getting drunk, ended up letting some girl stay at his place. The meat and potatoes of the series actually revolves around Sayu, who is this high school runaway. What you end up finding through her discussions with Yoshida and a coworker later on, Asami, is that she essentially has run away from home because of the abuse of her mother. And the unfortunate thing that came from this is her desire to essentially survive on the streets was that she would essentially give up her body to different men who would allow her to stay at their place, and eventually to the point in which they get tired of her and they'll discard her. And this turns into a really vicious cycle of her essentially, giving up her body in order to survive on the streets. And Yoshida, in allowing her to stay at his place, almost gives her a safe haven. And this is where that taboo comes into play, because technically in Japan, if somebody is found caught with a minor in their home, they're arrested. It's against the law. You cannot do that. And so essentially her staying at his place, even though it becomes a safe haven where she's able to essentially escape from giving up her body to different men and the abuse and the dangers that involve with that, it's still technically legal and is a huge danger to Yoshida himself. And as the story progresses, you kind of learn more about her circumstances of why she ran away from home, a little more about the struggles that she faced, the ultimate desire for her to ultimately try to do what she thinks she has to do in order to repay Yoshida, which is with her body, and ultimately his rejection of her and desire for her to essentially focus on just looking to her future instead. As well, of course, the conundrum of the taboo itself and the dangers that he faces. And interesting enough, I think a lot of my thoughts on this series does stem around that concept, the taboo itself. I think a lot of my curiosity of the series and the reason why I kept watching it was really kind of centered around, is this writer just going to do a typical he bags the high schooler concept, the essentially perversion and feeding into the taboo itself, like, oh yeah, good, he got the girl kind of thing. Yeah, bag yourself a high schooler. Because it is a touchy subject. This is a subject that is obviously going to turn a lot of heads. A lot of people are going to be infuriated by the idea of, here's an anime that essentially talks about a guy being the hero because he brought in a high schooler into his home, which is technically illegal and shouldn't be allowed because, honestly, and I agree, more often than not, they're not going to make the decisions that Yoshida does. He is seen as a hero, but at the same time, all the other cases, and it technically hits on this with this particular series, all the other boys did the same thing. That's why she thought that's what he was going to want ultimately, because all the other men that she was with wanted the same thing, her body. And it's kind of a struggle in that idea because I don't think the story does enough to hit on this particular topic and hit home on the idea of the dangers of what he's doing. But at the same time, it did technically address each particular concept. It addresses the idea of what she's been through. It addresses the fact that she did do this to basically survive. It does hit on the fact that he is considering the fact that this is dangerous. Every one of his coworkers, every single person that discovers that he is doing this, all said the same thing. This is illegal. This is dangerous. And even people that discuss it with Sayu tell her, you like this guy, right? You like that he saved you, basically, right? You like that you're in a better place and that you can focus on your future, right? Well, you need to do something now because the person that gave you that option is in danger. So it does technically address it. It just doesn't explore it. And I think that's really the only downplay that I would give it, is that it doesn't explore that danger. It only talks about it. And granted, if it did explore it, there's an argument to be made that he just goes to jail and that's the end of the story. There's not really much to explore there. It is interesting in that regard. There's no real kind of point in which he really does, get depressed or fearful or come to a mental dilemma on it. He really is kind of calm about the whole situation, and it is kind of a shocking thing in the end. But even still, I really did like that this story kind of happened, and it's kind of a struggle for me to say that, because in me saying that this is a nice take on something to kind of express the idea that not all people are evil, I think that's really kind of where it has to stay at, unfortunately. Like, I don't want to say this is a good story to tell because I think people should trust people more with high schoolers. That's not what I'm saying, because I think of anything, it's more often going to turn bad than good. It's not that there's more bad people than good people, but more on the idea of not jumping to a conclusion. And I think that's really the pinnacle thing there. That this is a story that almost feels like it's a statement on the assumptions we make of people. That we've gotten to the point where we've allowed bad people to control our thoughts. That because a guy walks by a school and smiles because he thinks that a kid playing with a ball is cute, we ultimately jump to the idea that they are a predator. And that's the dangers that we really face. It's that conundrum that we have on the idea of that we should never trust people enough because of the dangers of what it might turn into, that we ultimately criminalize all possibilities. And again, I'm not saying that that is a bad thing, because I think ultimately the idea of protecting children is 100% priority number one, but it's still the idea that not all people are bad. And while I don't find Yoshida to be the most complex character, he's also a character that I'm proud of in the end. Because based on the circumstances that the story gives Sayu, I was incredibly hurt by what she was put through. And I wanted her ultimately to be saved. And I knew based on the story that it's telling that her mother would never give her that option. Her mother was never going to be the one that would give her that safety. Or even her brother wasn't going to be the one that gave her that safety. Even though he is well-intended in the end, it's ultimately Yoshida that's the only one that gives her a beacon of hope. And I do like that. I think that aspect of the story is great. I did like the aspect that ultimately I am rooting for Yoshida, just because he is the only one that was able to save her. And based on her circumstances, he is the only option. That all being said, I think this story does technically have an issue with spinning its wheels. I will say that when looking back on the story itself, there was a lot of episodes where really nothing technically happened. And I think that's really kind of the issue with them kind of trying to build this relationship over a long period of time of him assisting Sayu and everybody ultimately having their say in the whole situation. Everybody has to show up to give their perspective on what they think. It ultimately turns into the same discussion over and over again. Everybody acknowledges that what Yoshida is doing is illegal and he's going to go to jail. Everybody doesn't think it's a good idea for him to, keep this girl at his home. Everybody then learns that, oh yeah, technically Sayu needs to stay there because it's dangerous for her to leave. It ultimately turns into this idea of introduction, take Sayu in, then spend an episode or so, each episode having each person give their take on the situation, and then ultimately try to find a resolve in the end, a more permanent solution in the end. And that's where I probably would give it some kind of negative. But at the same time, I'm extremely happy that this is a complete story. This is an anime that you can watch through it, and there's no light novel to go to. This is a complete story from beginning to end, and I really did like that aspect. That is a huge plus to me in anime anymore, which is unfortunate, but Visually, it looks great. I did like it. A lot of the character designs are good. I really did like the look of this show itself and the styling. Sayu is absolutely adorable, and I think that gives a little bit of plus to the storytelling itself, because I think her being as attractive as she is technically the point. This is what Yoshida essentially has to struggle with, and that's ultimately what everybody else ends up struggling with, is that he does have this really attractive girl in his home, and he's obviously not going to be able to resist her. So in the end, I did really enjoy this series. I thought it had plenty of context to it. I think it did a really solid job of telling a very taboo topic. I think it was, in a sense, respectful of the topic itself, even though you can make an argument to the ending saying otherwise. I think overall it was very respectful of it. It told us a solid story. Despite spinning its wheels, I don't really feel like the episodes themselves were a waste despite that. So in the end, I do technically suggest the series. Now, it's a struggle to do so just because it is a taboo subject and most people will find it very uncomfortable and pretty much borderline playing into something that is technically illegal. But at the same time, we suggest a lot of shows that are about murder and killing and violence and lots of sorts of different things. And like I said, the difference is here, it is respectful of it in the end. So I guess some can argue otherwise. But that's my thoughts on Higehiro. After being rejected, I shaved and took in a high school runaway. The most misleading title out there in anime itself. But I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you did, leave a like down below. Comment, let me know what you thought of the series. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I thank you all for watching, and y'all take care.